I'm going to read you something. These are real words from a real document, written by real people, signed by the highest ranking military officials in the United States of America. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. That sentence, casualty lists would cause a helpful wave of national indignation, was written by American military commanders about killing American soldiers on purpose to trick the American public into supporting a war. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This document exists. You can read it yourself. It's on the National Security Archive website right now. It was signed on March 13, 1962 by General Lyman Leminster, Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, signed by every single branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. It was called Operation Northwoods, and it proposed something that should make every American's blood run cold. To understand Operation Northwoods, you need to understand how terrified the American government was of Cuba in 1962. It's easy to forget now, but in the early 1960s, Cuba was genuinely keeping American officials awake at night. In 1959, Fidel Castro had led a revolution that overthrew the US-backed Cuban government. He then nationalized American businesses. He just took them. He invited Soviet advisors in, and he allowed Soviet missiles to be stationed 90 miles from the Florida coastline. For the CIA and the Pentagon, this was an existential nightmare. A communist nation allied with the Soviet Union sitting just off the coast of the United States. Something had to be done. In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. 1,500 Cuban exiles, trained, armed, and funded by the CIA, landed on the Cuban coast with the goal of overthrowing Castro. It was a catastrophic failure. Within 3 days, the invasion force was completely defeated. 1,200 men were captured. The rest were killed or fled. President Kennedy was humiliated on the world stage. The military was furious. They believed Kennedy had failed to provide adequate air support. They believed he had gone soft. They believed Cuba needed to be dealt with, decisively and immediately. But Kennedy had learned from the Bay of Pigs. He wasn't going to launch another military operation without overwhelming public support, and the American public had no appetite for war with Cuba. So the military asks themselves a question. How do you get the public to support a war they don't want? You give them a reason to, even if you have to manufacture it yourself. On March 13, 1962, General Lyman Leminster submitted a document to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. It was titled, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, and it laid out in cold bureaucratic detail exactly how the United States military planned to trick its own people into supporting the war. I'm going to go through what was actually in this document, because most people have heard of Operation Northwoods, but very few people know just how specific and how dark it actually got. The first proposal was blow up a U.S. ship. The document explicitly proposed blowing up a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba. Not a foreign ship, not an empty vessel, an American military ship, with American sailors on board. The document calculated, and this is a direct quote, that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. They were going to kill American sailors, and they described the resulting grief of American families as helpful. The second proposal was sink boats of Cuban refugees. The document proposed sinking boats of carrying Cuban refugees fleeing to the United States, real people, families, people desperate enough to cross the ocean in small boats to escape Cuba. The plan, sink the boats, kill the refugees, and blame Castro. Use the deaths of people the U.S. claimed to be protecting as a pretext for war. The third proposal, fake a commercial airline disaster. This one's particularly chilling. The plan proposed faking the shoot-down of an American commercial passenger aircraft. Here's how it would work. A real commercial flight would be announced, let's say from Miami to South America. The real passengers would board the plane at a public airport, but before takeoff, the real plane would be secretly swapped for an identical drone aircraft with no people on board. The real passengers would be secretly taken off and given new identities. The drone plane would then fly towards Cuba, A CIA operative would radio in a distress call, screaming that the plane was under attack by Cuban MiGs. Then, the drone would be remotely destroyed over Cuban waters. The wreckage would sink, the passenger list would be released, families would be told their loved ones were dead, killed by Cuba, except their loved ones were alive somewhere with new names and new identities, living a lie their government had decided for them. The document actually noted that casualty lists could be supplemented with actual bodies if needed, meaning they had thought about sourcing real corpses to make the disaster more convincing. The fourth proposal, fake attacks on Guantanamo. The plan proposed staging a series of fake Cuban attacks on the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay. CIA operatives dressed as Cuban soldiers would attack their own base. They would blow up the ammunition depot, they would start fires, and they would shoot American soldiers, their own colleagues. Then, they would capture themselves, claim to be Cuban attackers, and provide the evidence needed to justify war. The fifth proposal, terrorism in American cities. Perhaps the most disturbing proposal of all. The document proposed orchestrating a campaign of terrorism in American cities, bombings, shootings, civilian casualties, in Washington, D.C., in Miami, on American streets against American civilians. All blamed on Cuba. All designed to make the American public so angry, so frightened, so outraged that they would beg the government to go to war. The head of every branch of the United States Armed Forces signed this document. Every single one. They all agreed that murdering American civilians on American streets was an acceptable strategy, if it got them the war that they wanted. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara received the document. He passed it to President Kennedy. Kennedy rejected it completely, immediately, without hesitation. He reportedly told McNamara that he never wanted to see Leminster in the Oval Office again. What happened next tells you everything about the relationship between Kennedy and his military. General Leminster was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was reassigned to become NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, officially presented as a promotion. It wasn't. Kennedy had lost all trust in military leadership that had proposed murdering American civilians. McNamara later reflected on this period of his life. He said, and this is a direct quote from the Secretary of Defense of the United States, "We had military officers proposing things that were completely insane." Completely insane. Those are his words, not mine. The rift between Kennedy and his military brass grew throughout 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis that October, the Joint Chiefs repeatedly pushed Kennedy toward military action he refused to take. They wanted to bomb Cuba, to invade, to risk nuclear war. Kennedy said no. 14 months after rejecting Operation Northwoods, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. After Kennedy rejected the plan, the document was classified, top secret, buried, for 35 years. Nobody outside the highest levels of government knew it existed. Then in 1992, Congress passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act. The law required the declassification of millions of documents related to Kennedy's assassination. Operation Northwoods was among them. But even after declassification, almost nobody noticed. The documents were released quietly. No press conference, no announcement. They sat in the National Archives largely unread. It wasn't until 2001 when investigative journalist James Bamford published a book called Body of Secrets that Operation Northwoods became public knowledge. Bamford had founded the documents in the archives and published their contents in full. The reaction was immediate. ABC News covered it, the story ran everywhere. People couldn't believe what they were reading. James Bamford told ABC News, and I'm paraphrasing here, the reason these documents were kept secret for so long is that the Joint Chiefs never wanted to give them up, because they were just so embarrassing. Now they use the word embarrassing. That's the word to describe a plan to murder American civilians and sink refugee boats. Embarrassing. Not criminal, not monstrous, but embarrassing. And no one, not one person involved in drafting, reviewing, or signing this document was ever prosecuted for anything. Here's my honest take on Operation Northwoods. Kennedy rejected it. That matters. That's important. The system worked, but barely, because one man had the integrity to say no. But here's what stays with me. This wasn't a rogue operative. This wasn't one unstable general acting alone. This was the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, every branch of the U.S. military, sitting in a room together, reading through proposals to blow up ships, sink refugee boats, bomb American cities, and kill American civilians, and signing their names to it. None of them stood up and said, this is wrong. Not one of them refused to sign. Not one of them went to Congress or the press or the public. They all signed it. And then when Kennedy said no, they reassigned the general who proposed it to a comfortable NATO posting. Nobody was fired, nobody was prosecuted, nobody faced any consequences whatsoever. The question Operation Northwoods forces you to ask is deeply uncomfortable. If the entire Joint Chief of Staffs was willing to propose this in 1962, what else has been proposed that we don't know about? What plans are still classified? What documents are sitting in archives right now, waiting for a journalist to find them 40 years from now? We don't know, and we just can't know. What we do know is this. The most senior military officials in American history once sat down and wrote a plan to murder their own people. It was real, it was signed, and it was submitted. And the only thing that stopped it was one president saying no. That's Operation Northwoods, a fully declassified, fully documented plan by the United States military to stage terrorist attacks on American soil and kill American civilians to justify a war. You can read the original documents yourself. I'll put the link in the description. What do you think about this one? Does knowing this change how you think about government and military power? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If the Obscured Past is new to you, every week we dig into the history that got buried, classified, or deliberately forgotten. Subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. Until then, stay curious and question everything.